you very much. I want to start by thanking Solidar for convening this very important conference and thank everybody who's joined us. And I believe my remarks are going to echo some of what we've heard from our Palestinian partners, so that's a good thing. It shows that we're very much on the same page. I recently came across an article by the renowned Israeli author A.B. Yoshua explaining his call for recognition of the State of Palestine back in 2014. One of the reasons that he cited was the despair felt by both Israelis and Palestinians regarding the chances of ever reaching a peace agreement. And it struck me that while that argument still applies to the Palestinians, most Israelis have moved from despair to indifference. Despair arises when people see no path towards something that they really want, while indifference can result from a range of things, from ignorance to misinformation or disinformation, all the way to heartlessness. Whatever the source of their indifference, most Israelis have simply lost interest in achieving peace with the Palestinians. Now, you must be asking yourselves, how can that be? And the answer is that if you take the effects of COVID-19 out of the equation, life in Israel is great. In fact, the UN World Happiness Report for 2019 ranked Israel 14th out of 153 countries. So while the occupation touches every aspect of the lives of every Palestinian every single day, Israelis, except for those in areas that occasionally come under attack from Gaza, are largely unaffected by it. It's also gone on for so long that most of them think that the Green Line refers to Tel Aviv's new light rail system, and they have no idea that the city of Ariel, which features prominently on the TV weather map with no delineation, is actually a settlement in occupied territory. In looking to explain this ignorance, you should remember that those who were in elementary school when the Oslo process began are now approaching middle age. And the discourse they hear consists of absurdities like Israel must halt the Palestinian occupation at various sea, which actually makes up some 60% of the West Bank. The public's distorted view of the conflict was exacerbated by the normalization deals, which were cynically named the Abraham Accords in order to lend them an aura of biblical magnitude when they were really just business transactions brokered by the great deal maker sitting in the White House. And one would have expected that at a minimum, the UAE would have kept its ties with Israel to within the Green Line. But 2 weeks ago, it hosted a delegation of settlers for meetings with Emirati businessmen. In my view, Secretary Pompeo's visit to the Psagot winery in the twilight days of the Trump administration actually pales in comparison. After the normalization process gave Israel integration into the region without it having returned a single inch of Palestinian territory, the conclusion Prime Minister Netanyahu drew is that the way to achieve peace, and I quote, is by enhancing Israel's force. Let me add a word about the myth that normalization stopped annexation. What we call creepy or de facto annexation goes on all the time. And Israel had the audacity to announce new settlement plans on the very day that the Knesset endorsed the deal with the UAE. And last week, it opened the bidding for construction of Givat HaMatos, a new settlement that will totally sever Bethlehem from East Jerusalem. That, my friends, is annexation. As for the international community, it got all worked up about Israel's plans for formal annexation, which it claimed would undermine the rules-based world order. Yet it doesn't see the same threat in de facto annexation and reacts to it by repeating the same toothless statements it has been issuing for decades about settlements being illegal under international law. I find it somewhat delusional to think that the way to deter Israel is by issuing warnings that settlements threaten to make a two-state solution impossible, given that destroying the possibility of a viable Palestinian state is precisely what Israel's trying to accomplish. And despite all of its grand statements about upholding international law, the world has embraced the normalization deals, even though they constitute a reward to Israel for maintaining its current level of violations instead of raising them a notch. A week ago, the UN made headlines when it endorsed, yet again, a resolution recognizing the Palestinians' right to self-determination in their own state. It's pretty hard to see this as progress when you consider that UN Resolution 1397 endorsing the vision of two states was passed almost 20 years ago. As you all know, Albert Einstein defined insanity as doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. Is it insanity or is it cowardice that brings the international community to stick to the same messaging while the number of settlements grows and the Palestinian space shrinks? It's true that a few European leaders see a need for action, but they claim their hands are tied by the policy of consensus among the EU member states. However, that excuse doesn't hold water when it comes to recognition of the State of Palestine. As the world grappled with the looming threat of annexation of the West Bank, many voices called for recognition of Palestine if Israel were to go ahead. Among them were Foreign Minister Asselborn, Labor Shadow Foreign Secretary Lisa Nandy, and Ilan Goldenberg, who's apparently slated for a senior position in the Biden administration. While it was great to see recognition being talked about so widely, those who considered it legitimate as a punitive measure need to switch gears and call for recognition now as a positive step to create parity of esteem between the sides prior to, rather than as a result of negotiations. I'm going to conclude with a comment that goes back to my opening remarks about hope, despair, and indifference. Recognition would show the Israeli government that it doesn't hold all the cards. And it would wake the Israeli public out of its stupor and raise awareness that there's a nation to the east with rights of its own. As for the Palestinians, a recent poll found that 52% are against resuming peace negotiations with Israel at this time. I urge you to think about the effect recognition would have on that number. Thank you very much.